The night before the funeral, Emma sat alone in her father's study, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of his aftershave. The shelves were lined with books she'd never seen him read, files labeled in his precise handwriting, and a locked drawer she'd always assumed contained tax papers or tools. She hadn't expected to find anything of value. Her father, Mark Holloway, wasn't the kind of man who left behind treasures. But grief has a way of making people linger, searching for something, anything, that explains why a man becomes distant toward the very people he built his life around. It was there, beneath an old ledger, that Emma found the journal. A thick, leather-bound notebook with the edges curled and a stain of something dark along its spine. It wasn't labeled, but when she opened it, his handwriting, sharp, deliberate, and painfully familiar, stared back at her. "If you're reading this, it means I've failed to keep the silence I promised your uncle." Her hands froze. Uncle Paul. The name alone felt like a wound. She hadn't seen him in almost 20 years, not since the night her father came home bleeding from his forehead, muttering something about betrayal, and forbade her mother from ever letting Paul step foot in their house again. Every time she'd asked why, her father had said the same thing. "Some things, Em, are better left buried." But he hadn't buried them. Not really. He'd written them down. Emma read the first page in a blur of disbelief. The writing wasn't poetic or distant. It was raw. "We were two halves of the same dream," he began, "until one of us decided to sell it." The entries that followed were dated from 1989, long before Emma was born. They told the story of two brothers who inherited their father's business, a small construction company that had built half the town's homes. Mark ran the site, Paul handled the deals. They'd been inseparable, working side by side, trusted by everyone, until a project went wrong. A housing development on the south end of Willow Creek, flooded foundations, missing funds, and one accident that left a worker dead. "He said it was an act of God," her father wrote. "But I saw the papers. I saw where the money went." Emma turned the page, her chest tightening. The details were blurred by water damage, but one phrase stood out, underlined twice in red ink. "He signed my name." She leaned back in the chair, eyes burning. She'd always known her father was strict, sometimes unreasonably so, but she'd never imagined betrayal like this. She flipped ahead, scanning paragraphs that read more like confessions than memories. "The night I confronted him, he begged me not to go to the police. Said he'd fix it. Said it was for the family. I told him families don't steal from each other. He said families don't destroy each other either." The next line was scribbled, almost unreadable. "He didn't come home after that. I did, but not alone." Emma paused. The words sent a shiver through her. What did that mean? She flipped the page, but the next section was torn out. Just scraps of paper clinging to the spine. She searched the drawer again, hoping the missing pages were somewhere nearby, but all she found was a small metal key taped to the bottom. There was a note beside it, written in the same hand. "For the box in the garage. Don't trust what you remember." She stared at the note for a long time, heart pounding. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of what she might find or the implication that her father believed her memories were wrong. By morning, she couldn't resist. The garage still smelled like oil and rain. Her father's old truck sat under a tarp, and next to it, behind boxes of tools and worn-out boots, was an old steel chest with a lock that matched the key. Her hands trembled as she turned it. Inside were stacks of photos, newspaper clippings, and letters. At the top, a photo she recognized. Her father and Uncle Paul, standing in front of a half-built house, arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling. They looked young, proud, the kind of brothers who thought nothing could come between them. Underneath it lay a folded document. Holloway Brothers Construction, Liability Settlement Agreement, 1990. Emma unfolded it carefully. There it was, two signatures. One was her father's, the other, her uncle's. Only they weren't the same ink. Her father's name had clearly been traced over. She pressed her hand to her mouth. "He forged it," she whispered. The weight of those words hung in the air like smoke. For years, her father had carried this. Anger, betrayal, and the guilt of knowing his own brother had framed him for something that cost a man his life. No wonder he'd built his life around silence. No wonder he'd never let anyone in. Emma sat there for hours, piecing together fragments of his words. "I couldn't tell your mother. She would have tried to fix it. She always believed Paul had a good heart. But she didn't see what he became. She didn't see how much blood that lie cost us. The last line in the entry hit harder than anything else. If you ever find this, remember, truth isn't always the same as justice. Sometimes it just keeps the wound open. She closed the journal and sat in the dim light of the garage, her fingers stained with dust and ink, her pulse echoing in her ears. For the first time, she understood why her father had seemed like a man half present, why every family gathering felt like walking on eggshells, why he never spoke his brother's name again. The truth had been there all along, hiding in the silence between them. But as the morning light began to filter through the window, she realized something else. If her father had left this for her, it wasn't just to confess. It was to pass on the burden. He'd written the story, but now she was the one holding the ending. Emma didn't sleep that night. She sat on the porch with the journal on her lap, the metal key still warm in her palm. The air was cool and heavy with that quiet kind of stillness that only small towns have after midnight. The hum of cicadas, the occasional dog barking in the distance, the echo of her own heartbeat. Every word her father wrote seemed to loop endlessly in her mind. Truth isn't always the same as justice. She didn't know what to do with that. She'd grown up believing her father was the kind of man who told the truth even when it hurt. The idea that he'd spent his life carrying this secret, that he'd chosen silence, felt like another betrayal. She didn't know whether to pity him or hate him for it. The next morning, she drove to her Aunt Linda's house. Her father's sister had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to hold the family together even after everyone stopped talking. When she opened the door and saw Emma standing there with the journal, her face drained of color. "You found it," she said quietly. "You knew?" Emma asked, her voice sharp. Linda stepped aside to let her in, but didn't answer right away. "Your father told me to destroy it years ago. I couldn't." They sat in the kitchen, the journal between them like an open wound. The smell of coffee and lemon cleaner hung in the air. "He said you'd come someday," Linda murmured. "He said if you found out, it meant the past finally caught up with us." Emma flipped to one of the entries she hadn't finished. He wrote about the accident, about Uncle Paul forging his signature. "That part's true," Linda said softly. "But it wasn't just money. Paul made a deal with the developer to cut corners, cheaper materials, unsafe conditions. Your father tried to stop him. When the wall collapsed and killed that worker, she stopped. Her eyes filled with tears. Paul panicked. He blamed Mark, said he signed off on everything. There were witnesses who swore they saw the papers. But they were forged, Emma said. Yes, Linda whispered. But no one could prove it. Your father would have gone to prison if he didn't settle. So he signed the agreement. And then he made me promise never to speak to Paul again. Emma felt her stomach twist. So he kept the truth locked away to protect the family? To protect you, Linda corrected. You were just a baby. He didn't want you growing up thinking your uncle was a monster. Emma laughed bitterly. That didn't work out too well. Linda looked down. No, it didn't. But he thought silence was mercy. Emma left the house an hour later, the journal tucked back under her arm, her mind spinning. She drove without direction, ending up near Willow Creek, the same place her father and Paul once built their first homes. The land was mostly overgrown now, the foundations crumbling, the remnants of old concrete jutting out like bones. She parked and walked down toward the edge of the water. It was quiet, peaceful even. She imagined her father standing here 30 years ago, younger, hopeful, not yet burdened by the weight of betrayal. Then she saw a movement near one of the old lots, a truck, faded blue, with a man leaning against the hood. Her breath caught. Even after all these years, she knew that face. Paul Holloway. He looked older, thinner, his gray hair slicked back, his clothes worn. When he saw her, he froze. Emma, he said, almost a whisper. You look just like your mother. Don't, she said quickly, her hands shaking. You don't get to say her name. He nodded, shame flickering across his face. I suppose that's fair. I found his journal, she said, cutting him off. I know what you did. Paul's expression didn't change. He didn't deny it. He just looked tired. He told you everything then? Enough, she said. Enough to know you ruined his life. And mine, he said softly. You think I got away with anything? I've been paying for that night every day since. She felt anger rise in her throat. You let him take the blame. I let him live. Paul snapped, his voice suddenly hard. If the police had gotten involved, if the truth came out, he'd have gone down with me. He was there, Emma. He saw what happened. You think your father was innocent? She froze. What do you mean? Paul looked out at the water. The wall didn't fall because of bad concrete. It fell because Mark rushed the work. We both did. He knew it wasn't ready, but he signed off anyway. He thought we could fix it later. You're lying, she whispered. No, he said quietly. We both lied. That's what you don't understand. He didn't just protect you. He protected himself. The words hit her like a blow. You're saying he was guilty. I'm saying, Paul said, meeting her eyes, that guilt isn't simple. He spent the rest of his life trying to pay a debt he couldn't erase. Emma turned away, her chest tightening. She wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, she knew there was truth in what he said. Her father's silence hadn't just been about shame, it had been about survival. Why are you here? She asked finally. To see if he forgave me, Paul said. But I guess the answer's no. He turned to leave, his boots crunching against the gravel. He left you the truth, he said over his shoulder. Now you get to decide what to do with it. When he was gone, Emma sank to the ground. The journal clutched to her chest. The wind rustled the reeds. The water lapped softly against the shore, and for the first time, she understood what her father had meant all those years ago. Some truths didn't heal. They only kept the wound open. Emma sat in her car for what felt like hours after Paul left. The sun had begun to dip behind the trees, and the air grew cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The journal lay open on the passenger seat, fluttering in the wind like something alive. She flipped to the last few pages, ones she hadn't read yet. Her father's handwriting grew shakier toward the end, the once neat cursive turning into something almost frantic, as if the words couldn't leave him fast enough. If anyone ever finds this, I want you to know I wasn't trying to erase the past. I was trying to make peace with it. What happened that night wasn't just one man's fault. We both made choices, and I've spent my life paying for mine in silence. Emma felt her throat tighten. The entry continued. Paul begged me to tell the truth, to let the blame fall where it belonged, but I couldn't. Your mother didn't know the full story, and I couldn't let her. I thought I was protecting her, protecting you. But maybe I was only protecting myself from the kind of man I became. The page ended abruptly, followed by a single sentence written in uneven ink. Forgive me if you can. If you can't, live free of my mistakes. Emma stared at the words until the ink blurred with her tears. She closed the journal and started the car, driving without direction again. Somehow, her hands found their way toward the old church on Maple Ridge, the one her father used to take her to as a kid. It hadn't been open in years, but the door was still unlocked. Inside, the light filtered through broken stained glass windows, scattering patches of red and gold across the pews. She sat in the front row, resting the journal beside her. You lied to me, she whispered to the empty space. Her voice echoed back, soft and hollow. You lied to everyone. And now you expect me to understand? A part of her wanted to burn the journal right there, to let it all go, to free herself from the weight of it. But another part, the one that still loved him, couldn't. She opened it one last time, flipping to a folded note tucked into the back cover. It wasn't written in the same ink. It was older, faded. Her mother's handwriting. Mark, if you're reading this, I know what you've done. I know why you did it. You think you're protecting us, but secrets rot from the inside. Someday she'll need to know. Let her see who you really were. Emma pressed her palm against the note, her chest aching. Her mother had known all along. She wasn't just protecting him. She'd been waiting for the truth to find its way out, waiting for Emma to read these words. When she left the church, night had fully fallen. The air was cold and smelled of rain. She drove home, parked in the driveway, and sat in silence. The house felt smaller now, emptier, but somehow, the silence wasn't as cruel as before. The next morning, she packed the journal in a box and drove to her father's old construction site, the one he'd opened after the fallout with Paul. It had been abandoned for years, but the Holloway name was still faintly visible on the rusted sign out front. She carried the box to the foundation, where the concrete had cracked with time, and placed it down gently. You spent your whole life trying to bury the truth, she whispered. I'm not going to do the same. She didn't burn it. She didn't throw it away. She buried it under a loose patch of earth, just deep enough to keep it hidden but not gone. A marker of memory, not denial. She stood there for a long while before driving to her aunt's. Linda was on the porch, waiting as if she'd known she would come. Did you finish it? She asked. Emma nodded. And Emma took a deep breath. He wasn't the man I thought he was. But he wasn't the monster either. Linda smiled sadly. None of us are. Emma handed her the folded note from her mother. Linda's eyes widened as she read it. So she knew. She always did, Emma said softly. Maybe that's why she never asked questions. Maybe she was trying to forgive him while he was still alive. They sat together, watching the morning light spread across the lawn. For the first time, Emma felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not peace, exactly, but understanding. She didn't need to rewrite the past or erase the pain. The truth, in all its imperfection, was enough. Weeks later, she received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a short note, written in shaky handwriting. He forgave me before he died. I thought you should know. Paul. She stared at it for a long moment, then folded it and slipped it inside the journal's cover before sealing the box for good. That night, she sat by the window, looking out at the stars. She realized her father hadn't left her with debt, guilt, or shame. He'd left her with a choice. The truth had hurt, but it had also set something free inside her. Sometimes forgiveness wasn't about absolving the past. It was about deciding not to carry it any longer. And for the first time, Emma felt light enough to begin again. A few weeks passed before Emma truly began to feel the stillness settle. The chaos had faded, the sharp grief, the anger, the confusion, leaving behind something quieter but far more complex. The town went on with its rhythm. The same grocery store clerks greeting her with small smiles, the same familiar church bells ringing at noon, the same mailbox that now carried fewer letters and more silence. Yet, in the midst of all that normalcy, she felt changed, like someone who had crossed a river and could no longer see the shore behind her. One Sunday morning, she decided to visit Paul again. The last time they had spoken, his words had been hesitant, shaped by guilt and years of unresolved resentment. She needed to see him not as the villain of her father's story or the broken man from her own, but simply as someone who had lived through the same storm. His house stood on the edge of town, near the old quarry road where their fathers used to work side by side before everything fell apart. Paul answered the door slower than before. His face looked older, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes that mirrored her father's, were softer. You came, he said quietly. I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I, Emma replied. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. On the table sat a box of tools, some open mail, and a photo of their fathers in front of a newly finished house, arms around each other, faces lit with pride. Paul caught her staring. They built that place right before it all went to hell, he said. Sometimes I wonder if that was the last time either of them was happy. Emma nodded, her throat tight. He wrote about it. In the journal. Said that was the day he almost told you the truth. Paul sighed, rubbing his temples. And I almost forgave him that day. But I didn't. I wanted to make him pay for something he didn't deserve alone. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, thick with years they could never reclaim. He left something for you, Emma said finally, taking a small envelope from her coat. It was in the back of the journal. I think he wanted you to have it. Paul hesitated before taking it, his hands trembling. He opened it carefully, unfolding the faded paper. Emma turned away to give him privacy, watching the light fall through the window across the floorboards. After a long while, Paul spoke, his voice breaking. He says he forgave me, he whispered. He says he wished he'd told me sooner. Emma turned to him. He meant it. Paul's eyes glistened as he looked at her. You remind me of him when you say that. He had that same certainty when he believed in something. I think he wanted you to stop carrying the guilt, she said softly. Both of you. Paul nodded, setting the letter down carefully. Maybe it's time I do. When Emma left his house, the world outside seemed lighter somehow. The wind was cool, but not biting, the kind that carried the scent of change rather than endings. As she drove away, she passed the old Holloway property, what was left of it anyway. The barn had collapsed years ago, but the oak tree still stood tall, its branches stretching wide over the field. She pulled over and sat there, watching the way the sunlight threaded through the leaves. It struck her that forgiveness wasn't an event. It was a process, a slow rebuilding, much like those houses her father and Paul once constructed together. Maybe she couldn't rebuild the past, but she could lay down new foundations for herself. That evening, she began sorting through boxes in her attic. For the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid to face what was left behind. Among the old family photos, she found a picture she had never noticed before. Her father and Paul, young, sitting on the hood of a truck with their wives beside them. Everyone looked alive in that captured moment, happy, unburdened. On the back, in her father's handwriting, were 5 words, "Before everything went too far." She traced the words with her thumb, tears gathering in her eyes. Maybe, in his own way, her father had left her a map, one that didn't lead to answers, but to understanding. Later that night, she called Linda. "I saw Paul," she said. "And he's tired," Emma replied. "But I think he's ready to let go." "And you?" her aunt asked gently. Emma smiled faintly. "I'm getting there." After they hung up, she walked outside, barefoot, the grass cool beneath her feet. The stars stretched wide above, calm and silent. She whispered into the night, "I forgive you." It wasn't dramatic. There was no thunder or release of tension, just a quiet acknowledgement that the past no longer owned her. Somewhere deep down, she hoped her father heard it. The next morning, Emma visited the local community center. There was a sign posted about a charity renovation project, volunteers restoring an old family home for a widow in town. Without thinking too much, she signed up. It felt fitting somehow, to build something new where something broken had once stood. Weeks later, she found herself holding a hammer, the smell of sawdust in the air, sunlight spilling through the unfinished windows. It was hard work, but honest work, the kind her father had always loved. One of the older volunteers, a quiet man with gray hair, asked, "You ever built before?" Emma smiled. "Not like this, but I think it runs in the family." As the walls went up, she realized that maybe the best way to honor her father's truth wasn't through anger or grief, but through action, by building, by healing, by choosing not to let silence win again. And as she placed the final nail into the frame, she whispered, "We're done running, Dad." The sunlight hit her face just right then, warm and golden, like forgiveness itself. Months later, autumn returned to the valley, painting the hills in rust and gold. The town had begun to change too. Old buildings restored, new families moving in, and a faint hum of life returning to places once haunted by silence. Emma stood by the riverbank one late afternoon, where the Holloway and Reed lands once bordered each other. The river was calmer now, reflecting the orange sky like molten glass. She could almost hear the echo of her father's laughter carried on the wind, not as a ghostly sound, but as a memory that had finally softened. She had come to leave something behind. From her coat pocket, she pulled out the small leather journal, the one that had started everything. It was worn now, pages marked with her father's shaky handwriting and her own notes beside them. She had thought for weeks about what to do with it. Burn it, maybe, or keep it locked away forever. But as she stood there, she realized it didn't belong to the past anymore. It was part of the healing. She knelt by the edge of the river and opened it one last time. On the first page, beneath the words, "To my daughter, when the truth finds you," she wrote a final line in her own hand. It did, and it set me free. Then she closed the book and let the current take it. The leather darkened as the water lapped over it, then carried it gently downstream until it disappeared around the bend. For the first time in a long while, Emma smiled, not with relief, but with peace. That evening, she drove to the new house they had just finished renovating, the one for the widow, Mrs. Tanner. It stood on a hill overlooking the town, small but solid, with white shutters and a porch that caught the setting sun. Paul was already there, sitting on the steps with 2 mugs of coffee. He looked better, less burdened. When he saw her, he raised the second mug. "I figured you might show up. I wouldn't miss it," she said, taking the mug and sitting beside him. The view from the porch stretched wide. The same valley their fathers had once fought to control, now quiet, reclaimed by nature. "You know," Paul said after a long pause, "I went back to Dad's grave last week. Told him everything. About what your father wrote. About how wrong we both were." Emma nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you think they'd be proud of us?" Paul smiled faintly. "I think they'd finally stop arguing long enough to listen." They both laughed, softly, the kind of laughter that comes only after years of holding one's breath. As the light dimmed, Emma thought of all the versions of her father she had met through his journal, the angry man, the guilty one, the loving one, and how, in the end, he had been all of them. People weren't meant to be remembered in fragments, she realized. They were meant to be understood as a whole, flawed, human, and trying. When night fell, they turned on the porch light. Its warm glow spilled out across the grass, lighting the path down the hill. "I think this house was meant to stand here," Paul said quietly. "Like some things fall apart just so others can begin." Emma nodded. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is, not forgetting, but giving the story a different ending. Later that night, when she returned home, she found a small parcel waiting on her doorstep. No sender. Inside was a photograph, the same old image of their fathers standing beside that house they built decades ago. But this one had something new. On the back, in Paul's handwriting, it said, "We finished what they started." Emma placed it on her mantel, beside a small jar of river stones she had collected from the Holloway land. It wasn't a shrine, not a memorial, just a quiet reminder that history didn't have to bleed forever. Weeks passed. She kept working on community projects, helping restore what time and bitterness had nearly erased. People started to know her not as the daughter from the feud, but as Emma, the one who rebuilt the house by the quarry road, the one who brought the old families together again. One winter morning, she received a letter from a local historical society. They wanted to document the Holloway and Reed families' history for an exhibit on reconciliation, a story not of tragedy, but of repair. Emma hesitated at first, but then she agreed. She spent nights writing, not to relive the pain, but to honor the truth that had once almost destroyed her family. Her final line in the essay read, "Blood divides, but it can also bind, not by vengeance, but by the courage to remember without hate." Years later, children would run across that same riverbank, laughing where once there had been only echoes of grief. The old feud would fade into stories, and the journal, long gone, would become a symbol of how one truth, once spoken, could stop generations of silence. And every year, on the first day of fall, Emma would return to that river. She'd stand there with a single white flower, toss it into the current, and whisper, "We made it, Dad." The flower would drift downstream, caught by the same current that had carried the journal away, and she'd watch until it vanished into the golden distance, knowing some endings are not really endings at all. Spring came quietly, without the storms that usually swept the valley. The air smelled of new grass and distant rain. Emma stood beneath the willow tree by the cemetery, the one that bent its branches low like it was listening. In front of her lay two headstones, her father's, and, a few feet away, Uncle Thomas's. Time had softened even that small distance between them. The grass had grown evenly over both graves, and the wind moved through them the same way. She set down a bouquet of white daisies, the ones her mother used to plant along their fence line, and whispered, "It's done." For a long while, she said nothing else. There was no need. Everything that needed to be spoken had already found its way into her heart. The journal was gone, the house rebuilt, the feud laid to rest. Not because she had forced peace, but because she had chosen to live with the truth instead of trying to erase it. She looked up when she heard a car door close behind her. Paul was walking over, carrying 2 coffees. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, setting one cup beside her. "You always do," Emma smiled. He stood beside her, his hands in his jacket pockets, eyes resting on the graves. "They'd hate that we're friends," he said, his tone half teasing, half solemn. "Probably," she agreed. "But maybe they'd understand now, in their own way." Paul nodded slowly. "You know, I used to think the land mattered more than anything. That keeping it was how you honored family. But standing here, it feels like that's what broke them." Emma watched a pair of sparrows land on the willow branches. "They built walls out of acres," she said, and never realized the fences they were really putting up were between each other. For a moment, silence settled between them, comfortable, familiar. Then she took a deep breath, feeling the cool wind brush across her face. "I think I'm ready to leave the valley," she said. Paul turned to her. "Leave? For good?" "Not forever," she said. "Just long enough to see who I am outside of this story. Dad's gone. So is the feud. Maybe it's time I stopped standing in the middle of what they left behind." He looked at her, thoughtful, then smiled faintly. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Somewhere new. Maybe by the ocean. Somewhere where I don't have to keep proving I belong." Paul nodded. "Then I'll keep the valley for you, just in case you come back." She smiled at that. "Deal." They stood there for a few more minutes, watching the morning light shift across the stones, the sky deepening from gray to blue. Then Emma stepped closer to her father's grave and pressed her hand against the cool stone. "You did your best," she whispered. "I see that now." When she turned away, she didn't feel the same weight she once did when leaving this place. It felt lighter, like something had been untied. That afternoon, she packed her car, boxes, a suitcase, a framed photograph of her parents before everything fell apart. On the passenger seat sat a new notebook, blank except for the first line she had written that morning. This story begins after the silence. As she drove out of the valley, the road curved past the fields that had once divided their families. Now, they stretched endlessly. No fences, no markers, just open land. She rolled down the window, letting the wind tangle her hair, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped by what came before. She drove until the mountains faded behind her, until the sky widened into something bright and forgiving. A week later, she sent Paul a postcard from a small coastal town. On the front was a picture of a lighthouse. On the back, she wrote, "It's quieter here. I'm writing again. Not about them, about what comes next. Tell the valley I'll visit when the willows bloom." Months passed. Seasons changed. The house on the hill remained, paint peeling slightly, porch lights still working, laughter sometimes spilling out through the open windows. And every year, when spring returned, Paul would drive to the riverbank and leave a single white flower on the water, just like Emma once did. Locals said the river carried those flowers far downstream, maybe all the way to the sea. No one ever found them, but Paul liked to imagine one washed ashore near her new home, tangled in seaweed and sunlight. Years later, when Emma finally returned, her hair was streaked with gray, but her eyes still carried that same calm fire. She and Paul met again under the willow tree. The valley had changed. New homes, children playing, laughter instead of rumors. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a new leather-bound notebook. "I thought I'd start another," she said. "Not about loss this time. About what we built after it." Paul smiled. "Then maybe it's time the story ends where it should." Emma looked out at the horizon, where the river glimmered in the fading light. "Or maybe it's not ending at all," she said. "Maybe it's just finally right." The wind stirred through the willow branches, carrying the scent of wildflowers and rain. Somewhere far below, the river murmured softly, its current unbroken. And in that quiet, beneath the weight of everything that had been, the valley seemed to exhale, finally free from the echoes of old grief, finally at peace with its own story.